Hi, Novel Novice has asked me to do a vlog for you guys, and I did warn her that I do blink excessively and stammer a lot, so there's going to be a lot of ums and a lot of blinking. Just warning you guys. One of the things that I thought I'd talk about today, mostly because I'm terrible at coming up with subjects or topics for vlogs, and Sarah very kindly sent me some ideas, was how I came up with the idea for the pledge. And the idea for the pledge came actually very differently than the idea for the body finder. Everybody's kind of heard the story about how the idea for the body finder came from my husband when we were driving one day, and he threw out this idea of what if there was this kid who could find dead bodies. And like I've said this before, all of my husband's ideas are like 13-year-old boy ideas. His main characters are always middle grade boys, and I think it's because he's kind of a middle grade boy stuck in an adult-sized body. And he had this idea about somebody who could find dead bodies, and I actually thought it was a great idea. It's just my character was going to be a 16-year-old girl, maybe because I'm a 16-year-old girl trapped in an adult-sized body. And then also, because I'm a girl, there was going to be a fair amount of kissing. With the pledge, the idea came actually, it was a long time coming. It was an idea that kind of came with that original spark of what would it be like if somebody could understand all languages. But of course, those kinds of ideas have been done in different ways before, and I really wanted this to be something different. I actually toyed with various ideas to use that language ability, and one of my ideas was actually a werewolf book. It was way before the big werewolf explosion in YA, and I kind of toyed with the idea of doing a middle grade boy adventure book also, where a middle grade boy goes to a museum and kind of understands the meaning of some maps that he sees, where maybe the curator doesn't understand, and he kind of gets stuck in this, kind of caught up in this adventure. I tried on several different ways to make the language thing work, but nothing was really coming through and kind of calling to me to write it. But I was fascinated by the idea that somebody might actually just inherently understand all these languages. And then I, along the way, had met this woman who had grown up in World War II Germany. Her name was Marie Lucas. I met her while I was selling real estate, and she was being displaced from her home. She was not happy about it. The county was widening the road, and they were forcing her to move from her home. And so we spent several months trying to find her a new house that she was going to feel comfortable calling home. And during those, I want to say 4 or 5 months of us driving around all over looking for a house for her, she would tell me these stories about being a really young girl during World War II, and what it was like to be woken up in the middle of the night by her older sisters when the air raid sirens would go off, and they would run through the people's backyards in their tiny little town, and her sisters would throw her over these huge fences, and they'd hide in mine shafts outside the city until the sirens had gone off, or until the air raids, till the bombings overhead would stop. And she would tell me stories about what it was like as the Nazis tightened their stranglehold over her country, and her father, they were Germans, but her father wasn't particularly a Nazi sympathizer, and he would test the boundaries of what he could get away with as far as not complying with the rules of the Nazi regime. So he was in trouble quite a bit, and it came to the point where he was threatened to be taken away on one of the trains. And even then, they didn't really know what being taken away on one of the trains really meant. They just knew it was a bad thing. And so she would tell me these really horrific stories about living under this regime, under this Nazi regime. And those stories, as I was thinking one day about how this language idea would work, and I started thinking about what if this main character I had lived in a world where the rules were very tight and constricted, sort of like that Nazi regime. This woman's story started to kind of infiltrate, and I started to think about what it would be like to be woken up in the middle of the night by air raid sirens, or to have a government, or in this case a monarchy, who feels like it's losing power and so begins to tighten its stranglehold on its people to try and maintain power. Which sounds very deep, but it really comes down to I really kind of fell in love with these characters I was creating. It just took me a long time to get to build this world because I was trying to incorporate kind of these ideas of a world that was kind of out of control, which is kind of that dystopic element where everything's kind of falling apart. The world is just not a good place to live. And then to create, I also had kind of a fantasy element with I don't know what this is. A fantasy element because the characters, there is magic involved in the story also. So it just took me a long time, but it took me probably over a year before I actually wrote a single word of the story, even though it was kind of formulating in my mind the entire time. And that's just a long-winded way of telling you kind of how the idea came to be. So I've done some blinking, and I've said a lot of and that's kind of the bones of where the pledge idea came from.